In 532 CE, rioting in the Great Hippodrome of Constantinople led to the deaths of over 30,000 chariot racing fans who were in open rebellion against the emperor of the Byzantine Empire. Known as the Nika Riots, they remain one of the deadliest moments in sports history due to the thousands of fans killed in the racing ground. The Nika Riots were more than just hooliganism amongst the fanatical fans of Constantinople, as the riots evolved to take on a political stance that demanded changes in the empire and was a moment of serious political crisis. The Nika Riots demonstrate the way sports and politics are intertwined, and the way sports can be used by leaders to connect to the people, while also allowing the people to demonstrate their opinions. This talk will explore a brief history of chariot racing in Byzantium, the importance of the Great Hippodrome in Byzantine politics, and look at the lasting impact of the Nika Riots on Byzantine history. Chariot racing was one of the most popular sports around the Mediterranean Sea since the ancient period. Different forms of chariot racing were undertaken by Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Phoenicians, Greeks, and Romans throughout the ancient world. By the time of the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire that survived after the fall of the Western Empire, chariot racing was still the most popular sport that mixed elements of Greek and Roman traditions. One surviving element was the construction of dedicated stadiums for chariot racing called hippodromes in Greek and a circus in Latin. The first hippodromes were made in ancient Greece and were later copied in Rome, with many surviving in major cities and holy sites. The Great Hippodrome of Constantinople was the heir to the ancient and classical world of chariot racing, as it was the largest hippodrome built. Unlike most stadiums that use the natural environment of hills or valleys to aid in the construction of seating areas, the Great Hippodrome was entirely man-made and could seat over 100,000 people. The second legacy of chariot racing in Byzantium were the fan groups or factions called demis. There were 4 demis: red, white, blue, and green, named after the colors of the teams fielding racers. Each race was made up of 4 racers, one from each of the teams. By the time of the Nika Riots, the importance of the red and white teams had diminished, as they were absorbed by the blues or the greens. Support for these factions was not limited by social standing or geography, meaning that supporters in these groups came from diverse backgrounds and different classes in society. Chariot races played important roles in ancient Greek and Roman societies. Races were undertaken during religious festivals as part of funeral games and were part of the ancient Olympics. Celebrations also featured races, and they were often part of Roman military triumphs as a way to show the success of the state. While the races had important roles to play in the politics of society, the importance of chariot racing in the Byzantine Empire was heightened as a means for the emperor to connect to the people and have a dialogue with them. The emperors saw chariot racing as a way to display themselves to their people and highlight their power through the races. In the 4th century, the Byzantine emperors centralized all chariot racing throughout the empire, ensuring that all races were funded by the imperial court and treasury. Chariot racing had previously been funded by wealthy patrons or nobles, seeking to use the events to show off their power and wealth or curry favor with the people. The emperors, seeking to limit opposition to their power, took control of chariot racing to ensure that all the benefits of hosting such events was directed at them. While this gave the Byzantine emperors the opportunity to display their strength, it also opened them up to criticism in the hippodromes, as this was one of the few places people had access to the emperor and were able to voice their opinions. The fan factions began to transform from being simply supporters to groups expressing political opinions and ideas. The importance of chariot racing in Byzantine politics can be seen in the location of the Great Hippodrome in Constantinople. The Great Hippodrome was started by the Roman Emperor Septimus Severus in 203 during his reconstruction of the city of Byzantium to become a more important center for trade and power in the region. The design of the Hippodrome was based on the Circus Maximus in Rome, the main chariot stadium of the empire. He never finished it as he was forced to leave the city due to issues in Rome. In 324, Emperor Constantine the Great finished the reconstruction of the city and decided to move the capital of the empire to his new city. He renamed the city Nova Roma, but it never caught on and was instead called Constantinople, the city of Constantine. The Great Hippodrome was not only completed, but expanded by Constantine as it grew in size to feature space for 100,000 people. Constantine's other great work in the city was the Great Palace. The complex was started by Constantine next to the Great Hippodrome on the eastern side. The two were connected, allowing the emperors and their court to enter the Great Hippodrome quickly from their palace and enter their royal box, the Kathisma, that was located at the finish line in the center of the track. The Kathisma was very large, allowing the emperor to be easily seen by the spectators while also giving him a direct view of the entire stadium. The connection between the palace and the hippodrome demonstrated the way the empire saw chariot racing as a key component of imperial power that they needed to control. The importance of the hippodrome as a site of power in the Byzantine Empire is further reflected by the proximity of the Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral of the empire that lies across the street to the north of the hippodrome and the Great Palace. The size of the hippodrome and the presence of the Kathisma made it more than just a chariot racing stadium, as it was used by emperors during coronations to show themselves to the people and as a place for other activities and celebrations to take place. Emperors sought to show their might by decorating the hippodrome with ancient relics from Greece and Rome. The spina, the center of the course that the chariots raced around, were filled with statues, columns, and prizes the emperors had taken from other parts of the empire to show their power. Only 3 survive, including the obelisk of Thutmose III, also known as the obelisk of Theodosius, that originally came from the temple of Karnak in Egypt and dates from the year 1490 BCE. Second is the walled obelisk from the 10th century by Emperor Constantine Porphyrogenitus that was once covered in gilded bronze. And third is the serpent column from the Temple of Apollo in Delphi, Greece, that celebrated the Greek victory over Persia in the 5th century BCE. Other treasures line the spina and other parts of the hippodrome, including 4 bronze horses above the stables that are now in Venice on the Basilica of St. Mark's. The site of the hippodrome as a space for the emperors to display their power was also a site in which their subjects could voice their opinions as well. The stadium was open for dialogue between the demis and the emperor, who had to sit there and be present for the races. Missing the races was seen as a dangerous sign of weakness and disregard for the people that could cause riots and incite anger towards the emperor. As such, emperors had to be present to take advantage of the benefits of chariot racing and legitimize themselves. This allowed spectators to pose questions to the emperor and voice their opinions on different issues. Dialogue was not direct, and so it was through the factions that subjects were able to speak to the emperor. Thousands of individuals singing or chanting in the hippodrome made it hard for the emperors to ignore, and they responded through their heralds in the stadium to the ongoing chants. These saw emperors change their minds on different issues and act in the wishes of the crowds to garner greater support from the people. Other times, when they resisted the calls of the factions, it could lead to violence. The power of the factions to elicit a response from the emperors helped change them from just fan groups into larger political and social organizations in the empire. They had elements of hooliganism and street gangs before, but nobles and powerful figures in the empire joined, courted, and became the leader of the factions to use them for their own political purposes. It was this political side of the factions that helped make the Nika Riots so large and dangerous to the empire. Their place in Byzantine politics was informal, as they had no acknowledged role in the constitution or in the imperial court. Historians have debated if these factions were political parties or little more than just social organizations that were manipulated by nobles for their own agendas. What is clear is that by the 6th century, the height of chariot racing in the Byzantine Empire, the two factions held important social and political positions in the empire. The origins of the riots came in December 531, when hooligans clashed after a chariot race that led to a riot between supporters of the Blues and Greens, where several fans were killed. The culprits were arrested and sentenced to death, as was the Byzantine legal code of the day. Two of the accused, one blue and one green, escaped from custody and sought sanctuary in a church in January of 532. Both factions were not happy with the trials and called for the two fugitives to be pardoned. Tensions in the city grew between chariot fans and government officials. The Emperor Justinian moved to solve the growing crisis, as his power was not very secure. Justinian had been crowned emperor in 527, but was not very popular in the early years of his reign. New land, legal, and tax reforms had turned many members of the nobility against him, as they resented their loss of power and influence in the empire. Justinian was also in the midst of fighting a war against the Persian Empire, and needed to have a secure home front if he was to get peace on his terms from the enemy. Justinian therefore ordered chariot races to take place on January 13th to meet with the factions and hear their demands. Uniquely, the two rival factions of Blue and Green were both in agreement during this dispute, something that made Justinian even more worried. Previous disputes could be solved by playing the two sides against each other, but with them in unison, the emperor needed to meet their demands. As the races began, Justinian and the factions began their dialogue through chants and heralds to solve the crisis. Justinian acquiesced to several of their demands, including firing several of his ministers behind the reforms. He also commuted the sentences from death to imprisonment for the murderers. The factions wanted more from him and demanded that the murderers be pardoned completely. Justinian refused to budge, as he was unwilling to allow them to push him around. The demands made by the factions were most likely being made by nobles, who saw an opportunity to weaken Justinian. With both the Blues and the Greens on their side, they refused to back down. As the final races began, the two factions joined together to chant Nika, meaning victory or conquer. It was at this point they started rioting. The riots quickly spread throughout the city as the great palace was placed under siege. Fires spread, destroying much of the city, including the cathedral of Hagia Sophia. Violence spread throughout as the two factions became armed and fought soldiers and guards of the emperor. They demanded that Justinian fire two of his closest advisors, and when this did not happen, they took the senator Hypatius, the nephew of former Emperor Anastasius I, to the Hippodrome, where they crowned him emperor. Justinian made plans to flee the city, but his wife, Empress Theodora, is credited with stopping him. Theodora was not well liked, as she had worked as an actress and had been Justinian's mistress before marrying him. She and Justinian worked closely together, and she used her influence over him to stop their flight from the city. Theodora is said to have claimed, quote, "Royal purple is the noblest shroud," to push her husband and advisors to fight the rebels. Resolved to stay, Justinian and his court set out a plan to end the riots. They first worked to divide the two factions of the Blues and Greens. The Greens were seen as the primary instigators, as many nobles and senators who were opposed to Justinian were members. Both Justinian and Theodora were viewed as supporters of the Blues. Justinian dispatched one of his top officials, Narses, who was well loved and respected, to meet with the leaders of the Blues and remind them of the past differences they had had with the Greens, of Justinian and Theodora's support for them, and to hand out bribes to get them to leave. Many Blues did leave the Hippodrome, but not all. The next part of Justinian's plan was to dispatch two of his generals, Belisarius and Mundus, with troops to surround the Hippodrome and enter it. The two were told to kill all who remained in the Hippodrome. Caught unaware by the troops, the rioters and their emperor Hypatius were captured or killed in the mass slaughter. The Byzantine troops then spread throughout the city, hunting down nobles and anyone who had supported the riots. In total, the Nika Riots lasted 5 days. The total number of dead is unknown, with most historians placing it around 30,000, though others claimed it was higher. The city of Constantinople was left in ruins, as much of the city had burned down due to the riots. Blame for the riots often lies at the feet of the nobles who participated. Justinian and later historians blamed them as using the chariot-racing fans as pawns in their quest to depose and supplant Justinian. While elements of this is true, the degree to which it was solely driven by nobles remains unclear. The power of the people to oppose the emperor's decisions was displayed, as the social and political problems surrounding Justinian and his court were not just focused on the elites. The common people had grievances with the empire that needed to also be addressed. The unpopularity of Justinian in the early years of his reign reveal how much the emperors needed the support of the common people. The riots had both immediate and long-term consequences for the empire and the sport of chariot racing. In the short term, chariot races were halted and did not resume for many years. Justinian and his court worked to weaken the power of the Blues and Greens to ensure they could not be used in the same way again in the future. Control of the factions was placed into the hands of the court to regulate and control their actions in future chariot races. As well, the violence of putting down the riots solidified Justinian's power in Constantinople, as he was able to root out potential rivals and opponents to his rule. Hypatius was executed, and nobles involved were either killed or exiled, with their estates and families seized or ruined by new taxes to destroy them. The ruined city allowed Justinian to rebuild important structures as he saw fit, giving him and Theodora heightened importance in the history. The most significant was the Hagia Sophia. The cathedral had been destroyed in the riots, and under Justinian it was rebuilt, larger and more impressive. Completed in the year 537, the Hagia Sophia was the crowning architecture of the Byzantine Empire, serving as inspiration for Orthodox cathedrals and churches around the world, as well as mosques after it was converted to the Grand Mosque in the year 1453. The long-term consequences of the riots can be seen in the conquests of Justinian. With a secure home and increased wealth from taxing the rebellious nobles, Justinian sent out his generals and armies to conquer former territories of the Roman Empire. The general Belisarius, who followed Justinian and helped end the riots, became the most well-known commander, as he conquered much of North Africa and Italy, reclaiming Rome for the empire. For the sport of chariot racing, the riot began a slow decline of the sport's importance in Byzantine life. While the Hippodrome was reopened and the factions allowed to remain, the power it once held was diminished as Justinian controlled the factions and helped to stop the excessive demands they could put forward to the emperor. The importance of the races as a space for subjects to speak to the emperor declined, as they were no longer able to fully question the emperor. Races continued as forms of entertainment, but as spaces of dialogue, the sport lost much of its power. The heavy centralization of the sport into the imperial court damaged it when the empire as a whole began to decline. In the 7th century wars against first the Persian Empire and then the rise of Islam out of Arabia drained the imperial treasury. Unable and unwilling to fund chariot racing, only the great hippodrome in Constantinople remained in use as provincial races ended with the imperial court unwilling to fund them. The hippodrome remained an important site for interactions between the emperor and his people. The overthrow of Emperor Justinian II in 695 took place in the hippodrome, as the rebels used it as a public site to show his downfall and the elevation of his successor, the general Leontius. Racing remained in the hippodrome until the fall of Constantinople in the Fourth Crusade in 1204. Many relics from the hippodrome were taken by the Catholic Crusaders, such as the horses now in St. Mark's in Venice, and the stadium was used for jousting. Even after the Byzantine emperors reclaimed the city in 1261, chariot racing was not revived, and the hippodrome was used only for public gatherings. The abandonment of the Great Palace helped end the importance of the hippodrome, as the emperors no longer used it in the same way to display their power or be seen by the people. The Nika Riots remain an example of the dangers of seeking to use sports for political gain. The emperors sought to harness the popularity of chariot racing to advance their prestige and power, but opened themselves up to riot and rebellion. The desire to heavily control the sport led to its downfall, as it was no longer able to continue when war and financial ruin hit the empire that controlled it. The riots also demonstrate the way that sports remain vital outlets for society to express themselves to the powers of the day. The Nika Riots were not the first chariot racing riots, nor were they the last in the Byzantine Empire. What makes them famous is the size of the riot, particularly the size of the casualties, as well as the rulers in Justinian and Theodora, who became famous for their rule and are venerated as saints in the Orthodox calendar. As such, the Nika Riots remain one of the most well-known episodes of fan violence and the intersection of politics and sports in history.